Jake never thought answering a simple roommate ad would turn his entire world upside down. He was just a regular 28-year-old guy working at a tech company in Portland, trying to make ends meet like everyone else. His two-bedroom apartment was getting too expensive to handle alone, so he did what thousands of people do every day. He posted on Craigslist, looking for someone to split the rent. The responses were pretty typical. College students who wanted to party every night, people who seemed a little too interested in his personal life, a few who couldn't even spell properly in their messages. Then Zara's email came through, and it was different, professional, clean, straight to the point. She had good references, first month's rent ready to go, and promised to be quiet and respectful when they met at a coffee shop downtown. Jake's first impression was that she seemed almost too perfect. Zara was probably in her mid-20s, with this really striking appearance that made people do double takes as she walked by. Her hair was this unusual silver color that caught the light in weird ways, and her skin looked like she spent a lot of time taking really good care of herself. But it was her eyes that stuck with him, this deep violet color that he'd never seen before on anyone. During their conversation, something felt slightly off, but Jake couldn't put his finger on it. She answered all his questions about work, lifestyle, and cleanliness, but her responses sounded almost rehearsed, like she had prepared for this conversation really carefully. When he asked what she did for work, she said research and didn't elaborate much. When he mentioned his hobbies, she nodded politely but didn't share any of her own still. She seemed harmless enough, and honestly, Jake needed the money. His last roommate had moved out suddenly, leaving him scrambling to cover the full rent. Zara had cash in hand and seemed responsible. What could go wrong? The day she moved in, Jake noticed she didn't have much stuff, just his suitcases and a small box. No furniture, no decorations, no personal items that most people collect over the years. When he offered to help her get settled or maybe grab some basic furniture, she politely declined, saying she preferred to keep things simple. That first week living together was quiet, almost too quiet. Jake would come home from work expecting to hear music, TV, or just the normal sounds people make when they're home. Instead, he'd find Zara standing by the living room window, completely still, staring out at the street below. When he'd say hello, she'd turn and smile, but it took her a second too long, like she was coming back from somewhere far away. Her eating habits were another thing that struck Jake as unusual. She only bought fresh fruits and vegetables from the organic section of the grocery store. Never anything cooked, never anything processed. When Jake offered to cook dinner for both of them one evening, she thanked him but said she had very specific dietary requirements. He figured maybe she was on some kind of health kick or had food allergies. The really strange part was that Jake never heard her moving around at night. His bedroom was right next to hers, and the walls were pretty thin. He could usually hear his previous roommate watching late-night TV or talking on the phone. But with Zara, there was complete silence. Sometimes, when he got up for water in the middle of the night, he'd see a faint light coming from under her door, but no sounds at all. During the day, Zara was polite but distant. She'd nod good morning when they passed in the hallway, always cleaned up after herself in the kitchen, and kept common areas spotless. But she never sat down for casual conversation or joined Jake. When he was watching movies in the living room, it was like living with a really considerate ghost. Jake started noticing her speech patterns too. Zara never used contractions. She'd say "I will" instead of "I'll" or "do not" instead of "don't." Her grammar was perfect, but it sounded formal in a way that made everyday conversations feel like business meetings. When he asked where she was from originally, she'd say "far from here" and change the subject. The most unsettling thing was how she seemed to study everything around her. Jake would catch her examining ordinary objects like his coffee maker or TV remote with intense concentration, as if she was trying to figure out how they worked on some deeper level. When their eyes met during these moments, she'd quickly look away and go back to whatever she was doing. One evening, Jake decided to be friendly and asked if she wanted to watch a movie together. Zara agreed, but during the entire 2 hours, she barely looked at the screen. Instead, She kept glancing at Jake, watching his reactions to the funny parts, the dramatic moments, the action scenes. It felt like she was studying him more than enjoying the movie. By the end of the first month, Jake had gotten used to his mysterious roommate, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much bigger going on. Zara wasn't just private or shy, she was different in ways that he couldn't explain. But she paid rent on time, kept the place clean, and never caused any problems. In a city where finding good roommates was nearly impossible, Jake figured he should count his blessings and not ask too many questions. Little did he know that his quiet, strange roommate was about to turn his ordinary life into something he never could have imagined. The second month of living with Zara brought changes that Jake couldn't ignore anymore. It started with small things that made him question his own memory. He'd leave his laptop in the center of his desk before going to bed, but wake up to find it moved exactly 3 inches to the left. His phone, which he always placed screen down on his nightstand, would be face up and rotated at a perfect 45-degree angle. At first, Jake thought maybe he was just tired and not remembering where he put things, but it happened every single night, like clockwork. The movements were too precise, too deliberate to be accidents. When he mentioned it to Zara over breakfast, she'd tilt her head slightly and say something like how curious, or objects do, seem to have their own preferences. Her responses never felt like explanations, more like observations from someone watching an interesting experiment. The sound started around the same time. Jake's bedroom shared a wall with Zara's, and every night around 2 a.m., he'd hear this low humming coming from her room. It wasn't music or singing. It was something else entirely. The sound had this weird quality that made his teeth feel funny, like when you accidentally bite aluminum foil. Sometimes the humming would go on for hours, but it was so rhythmic and steady that Jake found himself falling asleep to it despite how strange it was. One night, curiosity got the better of him. Jake pressed his ear to the wall, trying to figure out what Zara was doing. The humming was definitely coming from her, but there was something else too, a faint electrical buzzing, like when old fluorescent lights are about to burn out. He could see a soft blue glow seeping from under her door, pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. When he asked her about it the next morning, Zara simply said she practiced meditation techniques from her homeland. Jake's cat, Whiskers, started acting weird around the same time. Whiskers was a rescue cat Jake had adopted 2 years earlier, and the poor thing had always been nervous and jumpy. The cat would hide under the couch whenever strangers came over, and would bolt at the slightest unexpected noise. But suddenly, Whiskers became fascinated with Zara in a way that didn't make sense. The cat would sit outside Zara's bedroom door for hours, perfectly still, like he was waiting for something important to happen. When Zara was in the common areas, Whiskers would follow her around with this weird devotion that Jake had never seen before. The nervous, anxious cat had somehow transformed into this zen-like creature who seemed to find Zara's presence deeply calming. Even stranger, Whiskers started doing things that cats simply don't do. Jake came home one day to find his cat sitting upright in the middle of the living room, staring directly at the ceiling with complete focus for over an hour. When Jake tried to distract him with toys or treats, Whiskers wouldn't even acknowledge him. It was like the cat was listening to something only he could hear. The plants were another mystery entirely. Jake had always been terrible with houseplants. His small collection of succulents and a half-dead fern were basically on life support, despite his best efforts to keep them alive. But during Zara's second month, something incredible happened. The dying plants didn't just recover, they absolutely flourished. His pathetic little succulent, which had been brown and shriveled for months, suddenly became this vibrant, healthy plant with thick green leaves that seemed to glow with life. The fern, which Jake had been ready to throw away, sprouted new fronds that were bigger and more beautiful than anything he'd seen in a plant store. Even more surprising, he hadn't changed his watering schedule or moved the plants to different locations. When Jake asked Zara if she'd been taking care of his plants, she smiled in that mysterious way of hers and said, "Living things respond well to positive energy. Perhaps your home has become more harmonious." The way she said it made it sound like she was stating a scientific fact. Rather than giving her opinion, Jake started paying more attention to other small changes around the apartment. His usually terrible Wi-Fi connection became blazingly fast. The old refrigerator, which had been making concerning grinding noises for months, suddenly ran perfectly silent. Even his ancient coffee maker, which had been brewing increasingly weak coffee, started producing the best cups he'd ever tasted. The breaking point came when Whiskers disappeared for 3 full days. Jake was frantic, putting up missing cat posters around the neighborhood and checking every animal shelter in the area. He accused Zara of leaving doors open, though he knew she was always careful about that kind of thing. She seemed genuinely concerned and helped him search, but there was something in her violet eyes that suggested she wasn't as worried as she should be. On the 3rd night, Jake woke up to find Whiskers sitting calmly on his bed, purring softly. The cat looked completely fine, actually better than fine. His fur was shinier, his eyes were brighter, and that nervous energy that had defined his personality for 2 years was completely gone. Whiskers now moved with this strange confidence, like he understood something about the world that he hadn't known before. Most unsettling of all, the cat now seemed to communicate with Zara in ways that defied explanation. They would stare at each other for long periods, and Whiskers would respond to her unspoken signals, jumping onto specific furniture or moving to different rooms. As if following invisible instructions, Jake was running out of rational explanations. Living with Zara felt like existing in a bubble where normal rules didn't quite apply anymore. Everything in his apartment was working better, looking healthier, and functioning more smoothly than ever before. But instead of feeling grateful, Jake felt increasingly unsettled. Something was definitely not normal about his roommate, and he was beginning to suspect that whatever was happening went far beyond unusual habits or cultural differences. Zara wasn't just strange, she was something else entirely. 3 months into living with Zara, Jake's sleep became a complete mess every night. He'd have these incredibly vivid dreams that felt more real than his waking life. He'd dream of floating through vast star fields, seeing planets he'd never imagined, and experiencing distances so huge that his mind couldn't even process them. The dreams were beautiful but overwhelming, leaving him exhausted when he woke up. These weren't normal dreams where things felt fuzzy or disconnected. Everything was crystal clear, the colors of distant nebulas, the feeling of weightlessness, the sensation of traveling faster than light. Jake would wake up with detailed memories of alien landscapes and cosmic phenomena that seemed too complex for his brain to have made up. Sometimes he'd catch himself sketching star patterns from his dreams, even though he'd never been particularly interested in astronomy. The dreams became so intense that Jake started having trouble falling asleep. He'd lie in bed, almost afraid to close his eyes because he knew he'd be pulled into these cosmic journeys. That left him feeling like he'd traveled millions of miles while his body never left his mattress. By the 3rd week of March, he was surviving on maybe 3 or 4 hours of actual rest each night. One particularly rough Tuesday night, Jake gave up trying to sleep around 3 a.m. He'd been tossing and turning for hours, his mind racing with images of swirling galaxies and distant suns. Figuring a glass of water might help calm his nerves. He quietly slipped out of his bedroom and padded barefoot down the hallway toward the kitchen. As he walked past Zara's room, Jake noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. Her door, which was always kept tightly closed, was cracked open just enough to let a thin beam of that familiar blue light spill into the hallway. But tonight, the light was much brighter than usual, pulsing with an energy that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. Jake knew he should mind his own business. He'd been raised to respect other people's privacy, and snooping on his roommate was definitely crossing a line. But after weeks of strange occurrences and sleepless nights filled with impossible dreams, his curiosity finally won over his better judgment. Moving as quietly as possible, Jake crept closer to Zara's door and peered through the narrow gap. What he saw inside made his knees go weak and his heart start pounding so hard. He was sure the sound would wake the entire building. Zara was floating, actually floating, about 3 feet above her bed. Suspended in the air like gravity had simply stopped working in her room. Her entire body was glowing with that soft blue light. much brighter than the faint shimmer Jake had sometimes noticed. On her skin, her violet eyes were wide open, but they weren't violet anymore. They were completely white, like looking at two small suns. Around her floating form, the air was filled with what looked like holographic symbols and equations, mathematical formulas, geometric shapes, and patterns that seemed to move and shift in three-dimensional space. The symbols rotated slowly around her body in perfect circles, some close to her skin, others floating several feet away. The whole scene looked like something from a high-budget science fiction movie, except it was happening right there in his apartment. Zara was speaking, but not in English or any language Jake had ever heard. The sounds coming from her mouth were musical and mathematical at the same time, like someone was singing complex equations. The rhythm matched the pulsing of the blue light, and somehow, even though Jake couldn't understand a single word, the sounds felt familiar, like echoes of the cosmic dreams that had been haunting his sleep. Jake stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, completely mesmerized by the impossible scene playing out in front of him. His rational mind kept trying to find logical explanations. Maybe it was some kind of advanced technology, or a really elaborate art project, or even a hallucination brought on by his lack of sleep. But deep down, Jake knew he was witnessing something that shouldn't exist according to everything he understood about the world. This wasn't a magic trick or special effects. This was real, and it was happening in the bedroom right next to his dot as he watched. Completely transfixed, Jake's foot shifted slightly and bumped into the small table that sat in the hallway. The table rocked gently and knocked over a picture frame, which hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet apartment like a gunshot. Instantly, everything in Zara's room went dark. The blue light vanished, the floating symbols disappeared, and Jake heard the soft thud of someone landing on a mattress. Within seconds, faster than should have been physically possible, Zara appeared in the hallway, standing just a few feet away from Jake. She looked completely normal again. Her feet were firmly on the ground, her skin had returned to its usual subtle glow, and she was wearing regular pajamas like any ordinary person. But her eyes were still transitioning from that brilliant white back to their familiar violet color, the change happening slowly like a sunset in reverse. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jake's mouth was completely dry, and his heart was beating so fast he felt dizzy. He wanted to run, to pretend this had never happened, to go back to his room and convince himself it had all been another weird dream. But Zara was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before, not the polite distance she usually maintained, but something that looked almost like relief mixed with resignation. "You saw," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Her voice had that same formal quality as always, but now there was something else underneath it. Maybe sadness, maybe fear, maybe both. Jake managed to nod, still too shocked to trust his voice. His brain was struggling to process what he'd witnessed, cycling through disbelief, amazement, and a growing sense that his entire understanding of reality had just been turned upside down. Zara studied his face for several long seconds, those violet eyes seeming to look right through him. When she sighed, the sound carried a weight that seemed ancient and tired, like someone who had been carrying a heavy secret for far too long. "I suppose it is time we talked," she said, and somehow Jake knew that everything in his life was about to change forever. Jake barely slept for the rest of that night. He kept replaying what he'd seen over and over in his mind, trying to convince himself it had been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But every time he closed his eyes, he could still see Zara floating in that blue light, surrounded by those impossible symbols spinning in the air around her dot when morning came. Jake wasn't sure how to act. Should he pretend nothing happened? Should he pack his bags and leave? Should he call someone? Though he had no idea who would believe such a crazy story. He sat on the edge of his bed for nearly an hour, just staring at the wall and trying to figure out what to do next. The smell of coffee finally drew him out of his room. In the kitchen, he found Zara standing by the counter, holding two mugs, but she wasn't using the coffee maker. Instead, she was simply holding the mugs between her palms, and Jake could see steam rising from both of them. The coffee was somehow brewing itself, getting hot without any machine, any heat source, any logical explanation. She looked up when Jake entered, and for the first time since she'd moved in, her expression was completely open. No polite smile, no distant friendliness, just a tired, honest look that somehow made her seem more human than she'd ever appeared before. "Good morning," she said, offering him one of the impossibly hot mugs. "I thought we might need caffeine for this conversation." Jake took the coffee with shaking hands. It was perfectly brewed, better than anything his old coffee maker had ever produced. They sat across from each other at his small kitchen table, the same table where they'd had dozens of polite, surface-level conversations over the past 3 months. But everything felt different now. "I know you have questions," Sarah said, her formal way of speaking now making complete sense, "and I know you deserve answers. I had hoped to complete my time here without this conversation, but perhaps it was inevitable." Jake took a sip of coffee, buying himself a few seconds to find his voice. "What are you?" he finally managed to ask. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her own mug. "I'm what your people would call an extraterrestrial," she said simply, though that term feels inadequate for what I actually am. Even though Jake had suspected something like this, hearing her say it out loud made his head spin. He set down his coffee cup with trembling hands and tried to process what she'd just told him. "You're an alien," he said slowly, testing the words. "Yes, though my species prefers to think of ourselves as explorers and researchers. We come from a star system that your astronomers have not yet discovered, over 200 of your light years from Earth." Sarah went on to explain things that sounded like they came from science fiction movies, but she said them with the casual tone someone might use to discuss the weather. Her people had evolved far beyond the physical limitations that humans still faced. They could manipulate matter and energy in ways that seemed like magic, but were actually advanced applications of physics that Earth scientists were only beginning to understand. "For many centuries, as you measure time, my species has been observing different worlds and civilizations," she continued. "We study how intelligent life develops, how societies form, how different species solve the challenges of existence. Earth has been particularly fascinating to us." Jake learned that Sarah's people had been watching Earth for generations, but always from a distance. They had satellites beyond human detection, observation posts in your solar system's outer regions, and ways of monitoring Earth's development without interfering. But recently, her species had decided that distant observation wasn't enough to truly understand humanity. "We realize that watching from space tells us about your technology and your wars, but it does not tell us about your hearts," Sarah explained. "We could see that humans build cities and create art, but we could not understand why you do these things. We could observe your behaviors, but not comprehend your motivations." That's where Sarah's mission came in. She was part of the first group of her people ever sent to live among humans, for extended periods, not to conquer or interfere, but simply to understand what made humanity so different from every other intelligent species they had encountered. "Most civilizations we have studied develop along predictable paths," she said. "They focus on survival, efficiency, logical growth. But humans do something we have never seen before. You create beauty for its own sake. You form emotional bonds with beings who are not genetically related to you. You dream of impossible things and then spend your lives trying to make them real." Jake listened in amazement as Sarah described how her people had been studying human art, music, literature, and relationships for decades, completely baffled by concepts that seemed to serve no survival purpose. They understood human technology and human conflict, but human creativity and human love were mysteries that could only be solved through direct experience. "I was chosen for this mission because I had shown unusual curiosity about Earth culture," Sarah continued. "I volunteered to spend one full Earth year living as a human to understand your daily experiences, your decision-making processes, your emotional responses to ordinary events." She had been given advanced technology to help her blend in ways to appear human to understand your languages instantly, to access your internet and databases to learn about human society. But she had also been given strict instructions to remain undetected and to avoid forming personal attachments that might compromise her objectivity. "I chose you randomly," she admitted with something that might have been embarrassment. "Your rental advertisement was simply the first one I encountered. That met my basic requirements for location and cost. There was nothing special about you that drew me here." But as Zara had spent these months living in Jake's apartment, observing his routines, watching how he interacted with friends and coworkers, something unexpected had happened. "I began to experience something my people do not typically feel," she said, her violet eyes meeting his. "I found myself caring about your well-being. When you seemed tired after work, I wanted to help you feel better. When you laughed at your television programs, I felt pleased by your happiness. When you were kind to your cat or patient with difficult neighbors, I felt something I can only describe as admiration." Zara explained that she had been sending regular reports back to her superiors, describing human behavior and psychology. But recently, her reports had become increasingly personal, focused more on Jake specifically than on humans in general. Her people had begun to notice that her research was becoming compromised by what they could only identify as emotional attachment. "They have been concerned about my objectivity," she said, "and honestly, so have I. This was supposed to be a scientific mission, but I find myself experiencing feelings that my species abandoned long ago in our evolution toward pure logic and efficiency." Jake sat there absorbing all of this information, his mind reeling from everything she had told him. His quiet, mysterious roommate was actually an alien researcher who had been studying him like a lab rat for 3 months, but instead of feeling angry or violated, he found himself oddly touched by her confession that she had grown to care about him. "So what happens now?" he asked. Zara looked down at her hands, and for the first time since he'd known her, she seemed genuinely uncertain about something. "That," she said quietly, "is what we need to discuss." The next few days after Zara's big revelation were the strangest of Jake's entire life. Everything in his apartment looked the same, but knowing the truth about his roommate made even the most ordinary moments feel surreal. When Zara made breakfast, Jake now noticed how she never actually turned on the stove. The food just somehow cooked itself. When she touched the pan, when she watered his plants, he could see them literally growing healthier as the water touched their leaves. Most importantly, they actually started talking like real friends instead of polite strangers. Zara began asking Jake questions about things he'd never thought twice about. Why he chose certain TV shows over others, what made him laugh, how he decided who to trust as friends. Her curiosity about the most basic human experiences was both touching and eye-opening. "Why do you keep photographs of people on your walls?" she asked one evening, studying his collection of pictures from college, family gatherings, and trips with friends. Jake had to think about it. "I guess because looking at them makes me remember good times. They remind me of people I care about, even when they're not around." Zara nodded like he'd just explained some profound scientific principle. "My people have perfect memory storage. We can recall any experience with complete accuracy. But you choose to surround yourself with imperfect images that trigger emotional responses rather than factual recollection. This is fascinating." These conversations helped Jake understand that Zara wasn't just studying humanity in general. She was trying to figure out what made life meaningful beyond just surviving and being efficient. Her people had become so advanced that they'd apparently forgotten why any of it mattered in the first place. But even as they grew closer, Jake could sense that something was weighing heavily on Zara's mind. She would sometimes stop mid-conversation and stare out the window, with an expression he'd never seen before, something that looked almost like sadness. Though she told him her people had evolved beyond such emotions, 2 weeks after their kitchen table conversation, Zara finally told him what was really going on. They were sitting on his small apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint the Portland sky in brilliant oranges and purples. It was one of those perfect spring evenings that made you grateful to be alive. And Jake was pointing out how the colors reminded him of a painting his grandmother used to have in her living room. My mission here is almost complete, Zara said, suddenly interrupting his story about visiting his grandmother as a kid. Jake felt his stomach drop. He'd known this moment would come eventually, but somehow he managed to push it out of his mind. When do you have to leave? He asked. In 2 weeks, she replied. My transport will arrive at the designated coordinates, and I will return to my home world to present my findings about human behavior and psychology. Jake stared out at the city lights beginning to twinkle as darkness fell. The thought of going back to living alone, of never seeing Zara again, hit him harder than he'd expected. Over the past few months, she'd become more than just a roommate. She was probably the most interesting person he'd ever met. Will you ever be able to come back? He asked. Zara was quiet for such a long time that Jake thought maybe she hadn't heard his question. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different, less formal, more uncertain than he'd ever heard it. I have made a request that has never been made in the entire history of my species, she said slowly. Jake turned to look at her, seeing an expression on her face that was completely new. For the first time since he'd known her, Zara looked vulnerable, almost scared. I have asked my superiors to allow me to remain on Earth indefinitely, she continued, to abandon my return transport and stay here permanently. Jake's heart skipped. What did they say? They're confused, Zara admitted. In our recorded history, no member of our species has ever requested to limit themselves to a shorter lifespan and reduce capabilities in order to remain among a less advanced civilization. They cannot understand why I would choose to give up near immortality and vast cosmic knowledge to stay in a small apartment with a human who burns his breakfast and watches the same TV shows repeatedly, despite the seriousness of the moment. Jake couldn't help but smile at her description of his daily routine. But then the full meaning of what she was saying hit him. You'd be giving up immortality to stay here? He asked. Zara nodded. If I remain on Earth in human form, I will age and eventually die as humans do. I will lose access to most of my people's advanced abilities. I will never again travel between the stars or witness the birth of new galaxies. I will be limited to the experiences available on this one small planet. Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. But why would you want to do that? Zara turned to face him fully, and in the dim light from their apartment, her violet eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. Because in these few months of living here, of sharing morning coffee and watching you laugh at silly movies and observing how you care for your cat and show kindness to strangers, I have learned something my people never taught me, she said. I have learned that consciousness is not about what one can do or how long one can live, or how much power one possesses. She paused, and Jake could see her struggling to find the right words. Consciousness is about connection. It is about choosing to care for someone beyond yourself. It is about finding beauty in small moments and meaning in simple gestures. It is about the warmth of friendship and the satisfaction of making someone smile. These things that my people consider primitive and inefficient, they are actually what make existence worthwhile. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. No one had ever said anything like that to him before. My superiors keep asking me to explain why I would choose limitation over unlimited possibility, Zara continued. But they cannot understand that I am not choosing limitation. I am choosing purpose. I am choosing a life that has meaning beyond mere existence. She reached over and touched his hand, and Jake felt that familiar warm tingle of her alien abilities. I have traveled across the galaxy and seen wonders beyond human imagination, she said. But the most wonderful thing I have discovered is sitting on this balcony right now, sharing this moment with someone who has become dear to me. If my people cannot understand why I would choose friendship over cosmic power, then perhaps they have forgotten something important about what it means to truly live. Jake looked at this extraordinary being who had disguised herself as an ordinary roommate, who had learned to be human by living alongside him, who was now willing to give up everything her advanced civilization offered just to stay friends with a regular guy from Portland. Are you sure about this? He asked. I mean, we're talking about forever here, and honestly, I'm not that interesting. I work at a boring tech job. I eat too much pizza and I still haven't figured out how to keep plants alive without your help." Zara laughed, and the sound was like music mixed with starlight. "Jake," she said, "you taught an alien how to be human simply by being yourself. You showed me that the most advanced civilization in the galaxy means nothing if you have no one to share it with. You helped me understand that home is not a place or a planet. It is wherever you find people who matter to you." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Portland, Jake realized that the most incredible adventure of his life was just beginning. His strange roommate had become his best friend, and now she was choosing to stay human forever just to keep that friendship alive. "Well," he said finally, grinning at the alien woman who had changed his entire understanding of what was possible. "You do pay rent on time, and honestly, who else is going to help me keep those plants alive?" Zara's laughter echoed across the city as the universe stretched out above them, vast and full of possibilities they would explore together, one ordinary day at a time.